I was watching a debate the other night between this really prominent theologian and a secular critic. And the theologian, he was just incredibly poised, soft-spoken, wearing a perfectly tailored suit. And he was speaking with such warmth about divine love and the ultimate foundation for morality. He looked like the kind of person you just trust implicitly, someone whose moral compass felt like it was fixed firmly on, the North Star of compassion. But then the critic brought up the Atlantic slave trade. All those millions of lives, 12 million, stolen and processed through this machine of human misery. And he asked a simple question. He said, why did God have time to give meticulous instructions on how to sacrifice a sheep or, which specific fabrics were forbidden, but never managed to fit "thou shalt not own another human" into the 10 Commandments? I expected, a moment of solemn reflection or at least a pained acknowledgement of a dark history. Instead, the theologian's expression, it didn't even shift. He leaned in almost pityingly and explained that slavery was an unfortunate economic necessity of the era. He spoke about it with the same detached clinical logic you might use to describe, like, a primitive tax code or an outdated supply chain. To him, the Bible wasn't failing a moral test. No, it was being realistic about the hardness of the human heart. He even suggested, with this chillingly calm tone, that for many, being enslaved was actually a spiritual mercy because it brought them into contact with the gospel. It was just this jarring, instantaneous transformation. One moment, he's the guardian of absolute universal love, and the next, he's essentially arguing that it's acceptable to violate a body if you claim to be saving a soul. That total lack of horror, that willingness to treat the most grotesque practice in human history as a mere pedagogical step, it just left me floored. It made me realize that for some people, the preservation of the system's coherence is far more important than the victims it left behind. It raises a question we usually try to avoid. If a moral framework requires you to justify the unjustifiable just to keep itself intact, what is it actually worth?
That confrontation, it really distills the core challenge we face when we look at moral and legal history. It's this deep-seated impulse to rationalize exploitation, violence, and injustice, but not as failures of the system. Instead, they're framed as necessary, even functional, parts of a larger, supposedly coherent mechanism. And that's the moment right there when the integrity of the system is valued above the reality of the human being.
And that's the mission of this deep dive. We're investigating this exact pervasive pattern across vastly different contexts: historical, economic, moral. We're going to move from, say, the codified subjugation you find in ancient religious economies all the way to the rationale behind perpetually cheap labor in modern Asia. We are hunting for that common thread, that human decision to prioritize the system's logic over the painful, messy, immediate human reality. We really want to know, when does necessity become justification?
Well, to start, we really have to establish this moral economy of subordination, because it provides the earliest and frankly most disturbing blueprints for how injustice gets woven right into the fabric of a legal structure. We can look at the Iron Age Israelite patriarchal economy, specifically through this devastating story in the book of Judges, chapter 19. This is the account of the woman who is only ever identified by her relation to a man. She's the Levite's Pelegesh, his concubine. She's virtually erased from her own story, except as an object of commerce and violence.
Right. We'll refer to her as Beth-Sheber, as she's sometimes named in scholarly analysis to give her some identity. And what stands out immediately is that her subjugation, it wasn't just random individual cruelty. This was a deeply codified economic reality.
It was absolutely systemic. The entire legal and social framework of Iron Age Israel was built on a hierarchy that directly determined a woman's value and her agency. Her life was, from the very beginning, fundamentally transactional. From the moment she reached marriageable age, prospective grooms, they weren't courting her. They were negotiating a bride price, a mohar, with her father.
So the fathers, the patriarchs, they were under this immense social pressure.
Tremendous societal and familial obligation to, and this is the language they used, dispose of their daughters in marriage or concubinage. The goal was to maximize family fortunes, establish political alliances, and maintain or improve their social status. Marriage was, it was less about affection and much more about a calculated economic transaction between men.
And the language, the actual words used in the foundational text, they reflect this. She's treated as a transferable asset, not a person with any inherent agency.
The language is absolutely key to understanding her dehumanization. When the Levite acquires her, the text says he takes Beth-Sheber as his Pelegesh. The Hebrew verb used there, LQ, is a common transitive verb. It means to take, to seize, to acquire. And this verb is used universally for taking people and objects alike. You could take a piece of land, a servant, an animal, or a woman. In Genesis alone, this verb is used over 40 times to describe women being taken into marriage, into rape, into concubinage.
And the passive voice there is so important. She is the object of the verb.
Exactly. She is never, not once, depicted as an active participant in her own acquisition or her own marriage. She's merely passively taken into this arrangement. The narrative deliberately strips her of any interior life, any will. It just frames her as an object of transfer. And this dehumanizing language, it's just chillingly maintained throughout the entire horrific episode. When she's later subjected to violence, she is passively handled. She is pushed outside. Her unresponsive body is taken home on a donkey. And finally, the Levite takes his knife to dismember her body. The linguistic framework of objectification is there from acquisition all the way to atrocity.
We also have to talk about her specific status as a Pilagesh. How did that, specifically place her in the legal and economic hierarchy of the time?
It put her in an extremely vulnerable position, legally speaking. A primary wife, who was generally acquired through a formal contract between wealthier families with a large mohar, she had certain legal rights, albeit limited. She might inherit property or control parts of the household, including other female servants. The Pilagesh, however, she occupied an intermediate position. A lower status wife, often reserved for secondary unions of concubinage. She was often a foreign captive, a slave, or a lower status servant who was temporarily elevated. Scholars often describe her as a cheap bridal commodity compared to a primary wife. Her status essentially provided sexual and reproductive services without the full legal protections or economic entitlements of a main wife. This codified hierarchy was essential to maintain the patriarchal legal economy. It ensured that women existed in a gradient of chattel status.
So when she finally does something autonomous, she leaves, she returns to her father, that one flicker of agency has to be shut down immediately by the system's language.
It's her one and only recorded political and personal act, opting out of sexual obedience and returning to her birth family. So what does the narrative do? It immediately seeks to delegitimize her departure. It says she commits whoredom against him. This accusation is crucial. It functions as, classic slut-shaming. The purpose isn't to explain why she left. Maybe she was fleeing abuse, which seems highly likely. No, the purpose is to characterize her departure as an offense against the prevailing social and sexual order. And this accusation, it diverts all attention and all scrutiny away from the violent social and economic patterns that underpinned her entire life.
It effectively justifies the violence that he eventually allows to happen to her by painting her as the one who started it all, the one who offended the system first. And this is compounded by the womanist interpretation that views her journey, that unnarrated trip across tribal borders from Judah to Ephraim, as an implicit transportation of human property.
That perspective is devastating because it foregrounds what the text just completely ignores. This woman, who had just been economically transacted and now politically condemned, is moving across borders under conditions of extreme vulnerability. It's an act of human trafficking that the story just treats as, necessary, inconsequential background noise. It's just there to move the plot to the main political event.
And this is the system's ultimate deflection. After the subsequent unimaginable gang violence and horror visited upon Bathsheba, the narrative does not pause. It doesn't critique the violent economic systems, the laws of the Pilagesh, or the religious texts that sealed her fate.
The focus shifts entirely, instantly. Her trauma and her death are appropriated to serve a political moral. There was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Her suffering is used as the justification for centralizing and increasing punitive state power. The political moral completely overrides the moral reality. The system cannibalizes her suffering to legitimize its own consolidation. Her injustice is forgotten. The need for a stronger, more coherent central authority is what matters. And that tells us that the preservation of the legal and political system's coherence, the need for order, is deemed far more important than achieving justice for the victim it deliberately created.
So the lesson of Bathsheba is not, don't treat women as property. The lesson is, we need a stronger government. That's a chillingly effective act of rationalization.
It is. And if we follow this thread of rationalization, we see that when centralized power shifts from, say, a theological system to a colonial one, the justification for control often moves from legal status to spiritual submission. Colonial enterprises, universally, they require the systematic dehumanization of the conquered, and religion often serves as the most effective catalyst for that.
Okay, so let's move to the Spanish colonial narrative in the Philippines, specifically focusing on how the story of the Santo Niño de Cebu, the revered image of the child Jesus, was used.
The early accounts from Ferdinand Magellan's voyage, particularly Antonio Pigafetta's journal, give us a very clear blueprint for this conditional humanization. Pigafetta is describing the events of 1521, specifically the conversion on baptism of the local ruler Queen Harahumame and her husband Raja Humabon.
And it's the sequencing, right? The order in which Pigafetta describes the queen is what's so revealing.
Absolutely. Pigafetta details how the queen is brought in, sitting on a cushion, and she's shown the images, the lady, the child Jesus, the cross. She's moved to tears, asked for baptism, and is given the name Juana. It is only after her conversion, after her rebirth into Catholicism, that Pigafetta offers a detailed physical description of her. Suddenly, he notes that she is young and beautiful, with a demeanor worthy of admiration, and she's dressed in rich robes and a crown like the tiara of the Pope.
The implication is that, from the Spanish point of view, indigenous peoples were only worthy of detailed attention, of description, of humanization, after they conformed to the European religious and cultural framework.
Their inherent worth was conditional on adopting the system's narrative. This narrative sequencing, it frames the entire colonial project. Conformity and submission are the prerequisites for acceptance and indeed for being seen as fully human. This powerful origin story of the miraculous Santo Niño's arrival and its enduring presence, it infiltrates every layer of modern Filipino society. You see it in political rhetoric, in education, in family life.
And the practical effect is that it upholds a racialized colonial power structure by just eliminating the agency and complexity of the indigenous leaders.
It does. The narrative implies that leaders like Harahumai and Raja Humabon just thoughtlessly, almost magically adopted the Santo Niño because it was presented to them. It erases the profound complexity of their pre-Hispanicized origins and their religious practices. They are severed from their indigeneity. And the colonial image, the agent of their subjugation, is placed at the very center of their modern identity. The system needs this coherent, miraculous narrative to justify the violence and conquest that followed. It ensures that the former colonial subject internalizes the system's own righteousness.
That is spiritual subjugation. So now let's shift to a more secular form of this, where the rationale for exploitation moves from spiritual conformity to biological threat. We see this vividly at the U.S.-Mexico border. The contagion of labor.
This transition really demonstrates how the system's justification just adapts to whatever threat is most politically useful at the time. In the early 20th century, especially with the turmoil of the Mexican Revolution, the U.S. had a desperate need for manual laborers, for agriculture, mining, railroads. They were actively recruiting Mexican citizens, promising stability and opportunity. But this influx, at the same time, triggered intense xenophobia in white border communities.
And white politicians, someone like Mayor Tom Lea of El Paso, masterfully leveraged the pretext of public health, specifically typhus, which is spread by body lice. They used this medical crisis to characterize Mexicans as inherently dirty, lousy, destitute.
And this narrative, which painted Mexican bodies as a biological threat to a healthy, modern America, was used to justify horrific and invasive purification protocols in border cities. These weren't genuine health measures designed to treat the sick. They were procedures designed to establish racial superiority and control. This included forcing occupants of Mexican neighborhoods into required kerosene and vinegar baths, having their heads shaved, and the public burning of their clothing.
And the tragedy at the El Paso jail really shows the sheer recklessness of these protocols.
Yes, in 1916, at one of the inspection stations, the kerosene used for delousing was stored too close to a heat source. It caught fire, and it killed 27 people, most of them Mexican or Mexican-American travelers and residents. But the horrifying link to future atrocities is even darker. The U.S. Public Health Service also employed Zyklon B for fumigating the clothes of those crossing the border.
Zyklon B. That's the chemical the Nazis later used in the concentration camps. It's just chilling that the language of public health disinfection was used as a direct prequel to one of the 20th century's great atrocities.
It really demonstrates the power of a dehumanizing narrative. Once a group is systemically designated as contagious vermin that need disinfection, the door opens to previously unthinkable violence. The U.S. system justified using a highly toxic chemical to treat clothes because it was treating the bodies beneath them as infectious threats.
But this systematic dehumanization, it was conveniently set aside when the system needed the labor, which paved the way for the Bracero program in 1942.
Right. With World War II causing severe labor shortages, the U.S. government established the Bracero program, an agreement with Mexico that imported millions of contract agricultural workers. And the language used to describe these workers fundamentally reduced their status to just an economic function. The word bracero, which colloquially means laborer, stems directly from brazo, meaning arm.
So conceptually, the worker is just reduced to a productive working arm, completely detached from a full human identity.
Exactly. They were simply a disposable, useful tool to fill jobs left vacant by citizens at war. And to reinforce this status, the status of being necessary yet dangerous, these laborers were subjected to more toxic protocols. They were systematically sprayed with the powerful pesticide DDT at the border, a practice prescribed and enforced by biomedical doctors. Their bodies were physically treated as disposable vessels for productive work, a contagious threat that could be simultaneously used and poisoned. It's all about prioritizing the economic function of the arm over the dignity and life of the person. This pattern of rationalization, whether it's colonial history or economic necessity, shows that the system's demand for cheap, compliant labor always comes first.
That transition from colonial exploitation to modern economic strategy is so key. We are now seeing the exact same imperative. The need for cheap, compliant labor play out in the global pursuit of competitive advantage, particularly in modernizing Asia. But we need to dig into whether this cheap labor is truly an economic necessity or just another form of systemic rationalization.
The necessity argument is rooted in standard economic models, particularly the new classical models, which assume perfect, self-equilibrating labor markets. In this ideal scenario, competitive low wages are automatically the optimal strategy for securing a country's position in global export markets. However, development theory offers a much sharper critique by acknowledging institutional reality.
And what's the institutional reality that it acknowledges that the classic models just ignore?
Well, development theory recognizes the common reality of institutionally determined dualistic labor markets. So you have a modern industrial sector coexisting with a vast, often backward agricultural sector. In that agricultural sector, labor is often redundant, meaning the marginal productivity of an additional worker is negligible, sometimes even zero. Because traditional wage theories fail when productivity is zero, workers have to rely on institutionally determined wages, a minimum subsistence floor, family redistribution, state enforcement. So the assumption that competitive low wages are always optimal for export-led growth is just flawed, because it ignores the structural reality of these dual labor markets.
So the pursuit of maximum labor flexibility and the lowest possible costs can actually be counterproductive for long-run stability. And this brings us to these concepts of the paradox of success and bastard export-led growth.
This is really where the rationalization breaks down scientifically. The paradox of success shows that if wages are too flexible, too responsive to short-term demand, they can become destabilizing. So imagine an economy that has staked its entire global position on being the absolute cheapest manufacturer. If a world boom happens, demand spikes, and those hyper-elastic wages will rise significantly. Now, if that economy has a high price elasticity of external trade, meaning buyers are very sensitive to price changes, that rise in wage immediately causes the economy to lose its market share.
So their initial success, just being cheap, ended up destroying their future viability because they priced themselves out of the market during their own temporary boom.
Precisely. This results in what's termed bastard export-led growth. The growth is unsustainable, it's temporary, and it creates this trade-off between growth and long-term productivity and stability. Think of it like a business that sells knockoff electronics. They succeed wildly by being cheap, but the moment they try to invest in quality or technology or better wages, the moment their price rises, their entire customer base, who only value the low cost, immediately leaves. Their initial strategy of maximizing low-cost labor ultimately destroyed their future viability and prevented them from moving up the economic value chain.
But history shows us this doesn't have to be the case. South Korea, after democratization, basically demonstrated the opposite. A strong capital-labor compromise can actually propel growth.
South Korea is the counterexample of a virtuous cycle. Before 1987, the system was heavily authoritarian, severely repressing labor rights to maintain low export costs. However, democratization led to this sudden eruption of strong unionism, massive waves of strikes, rapid organizational expansion. The result was massive real wage increases. For instance, manufacturing wages rose by 18.3% in real terms in 1989 alone.
And most low-wage focused economists would have predicted that a wage shock like that would just destroy South Korea's export competitiveness. But what happened instead?
The rapid wage growth actually fueled a shift in the engine of growth. It propelled strong private consumption and high rates of investment. The economy pivoted from being purely export-led, relying entirely on external demand, to one that was powered significantly by domestic demand. And this is the virtuous export-led growth cycle. Higher wages led to higher domestic demand, which sustained high rates of capacity utilization and incentivized businesses to invest in high-tech, high-productivity processes rather than just relying on cheap bodies. So the rising strength of the working class ultimately undermined the very authoritarian system that had repressed them. It demonstrated that economic development, when it's distributed, can generate stronger, more autonomous social classes and a more resilient, coherent economy.
So the necessity of cheap labor was really just a rationalization for authoritarian control. When that control was removed, the economy found a better, more stable path. Yet, in other parts of Asia, the priority remains fixed on keeping wages low by institutionalizing control through perpetual flexibility.
We see this so clearly in the Philippines and Thailand. After the Philippines' earlier policy of import substitution industrialization, or ISI, was criticized for creating deep income inequality, for providing privileged positions for only a few formal sector workers. The institutional push shifted violently toward export-oriented industrialization, or EOI.
And EOI, by its very nature, demands maximum labor market flexibility. It requires scaling down worker protections to compete on a global scale.
This transition was enforced ruthlessly under martial law in the 1970s. The government established what they called institutions of wage control, specifically to keep real wages artificially low to support the open economy. This involved curtailing all labor rights, banning strikes, and creating regulatory bodies whose function wasn't to ensure fair pay, but to limit any wage increases workers might gain through collective agreements. In real terms, the mandated minimum wages often sank below their original legislated rates because of inflation, and compliance was minimal. Numerous exemptions were granted to so-called distressed industries. It was a deliberate systemic mechanism to ensure that labor remained a cheap, disposable commodity.
And that institutional trend continues today, right?
Yeah.
Through more subtle mechanisms of precarious employment in both the Philippines and Thailand.
The modern trend is to maximize flexibility, to maintain those competitive low costs, and avoid the costs and organizational power that come with unionization. This is achieved through two primary interconnected mechanisms. First is casualization. Firms just reduce their permanent employee numbers and transfer duties to temporary workers on fixed, renewable contracts. In major industrial areas in Thailand, for instance, temporary workers can make up as much as 23% of the industrial workforce.
And the second mechanism, subcontracting and agency hiring, that essentially just outsources the labor problem.
Correct. Firms outsource production or specialized services to smaller, non-unionized entities, or they rely heavily on service agencies to supply their labor. The motivation is purely cost reduction and dodging regulatory burden. Agency hiring allows firms to realize cost differentials, lower wages, fewer benefits, and it lets them avoid the organizational complexity of regularized, unionized workers.
This sounds like a completely deliberate effort to keep workers perpetually vulnerable, to prevent them from ever meeting the threshold for mandated rights.
It is entirely deliberate. In the garment industries in the Philippines, for example, temporary workers hired through agencies are often kept perpetually temporary. They do this by terminating their contracts just before the mandatory regularization period, which is typically 6 months. Then they're rehired a few weeks later as new, casual workers. This practice institutionalizes precarious employment. It ensures that the labor force remains perpetually below the threshold for mandated protection and organizational power. The system maintains its cheap labor coherence by systematically denying individual workers a stable, protected status. The economic rationalization is maintained, but at the cost of the workers' security and long-term dignity. And this pattern, this willingness to sacrifice human reality to protect the coherence of the system, it isn't limited to economics or ancient law. It pervades how we construct our grand historical and political narratives. We need our heroes and our histories to make sense, even when the facts are wildly inconsistent.
Alexander the Great is the perfect illustration of this. To maintain that coherent narrative of his conquest and greatness, we as observers have to accommodate a figure who is simultaneously a brilliant hero and a monstrous tyrant.
We celebrate Alexander, the ambitious military commander. We focus on his tactical genius, his strategic use of the cavalry wedge to shatter the Persian line at the Battle of Ischus. That's the heroic Alexander, the calculated conqueror.
But that heroism has to exist alongside the evidence of Alexander, the destructive tyrant, particularly when you look at the sheer brutal statistics of the siege of Tyre in 332 BC.
The casualty figures are staggering, and they completely defy the heroic narrative. Historical accounts suggest that after the city was finally taken, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 Tyrian soldiers were slain outright. Then, as a display of brutal intimidation, Alexander ordered 2,000 captured soldiers to be crucified along the coastline. And finally, a massive civilian population, estimates range widely, but you're looking at 13,000 to 30,000 non-combatants were sold into slavery.
And the cost to Alexander's own army? Minimal.
Arrian suggests Macedonian losses over the entire 7-month siege were only about 400 soldiers. That horrifying imbalance, slaying thousands, crucifying thousands more, enslaving tens of thousands, all while incurring minimal losses, it paints a picture of cold-blooded, reckless monstrosity. Yet, to preserve the legacy of Alexander the Great, historical scholarship has to find an interpretive rubric that embraces this simultaneous brilliance and brutality. If we only accept the tyrant, the foundation of the empire collapses morally. If we only accept the hero, we ignore the blood-soaked reality. The system of history requires that coherent, unified narrative to remain intact, even if it has to rationalize mass cruelty.
And we see the struggle between the ideal of coherence and messy reality played out acutely in legal systems, particularly when the ideal of the rule of law encounters entrenched political traditions, which is often the case in Asia.
Rule of law, in its Western ideal, is fundamentally designed to curb arbitrary power, to ensure that all citizens are equally bound by universal, abstract legal principles. The difficulty in institutionalizing this ideal in many Asian contexts stems partly from the historical perception that it's a foreign imposition. Instead of the law being a categorical imperative, some cultural traditions may prioritize moral consensus or social harmony or reliance on extrajudicial compromise over formal litigation.
So when a country like China, for instance, attempts to modernize its legal framework, there's this persistent deep gap between the legal norms that are written down and the functional legal reality people actually experience.
The overt purpose of Chinese law since the 1980s has been to standardize behavior, moving away from arbitrary policy decree. However, in practice, the law is constantly read and executed in accordance with extra-legal norms, political expediency, and personal connections, guangxi. Guangxi involves these complex personal networks and reciprocal obligations. For example, a formal legal ruling might be impossible to enforce against an individual because the official or judge responsible is connected to them through a powerful shared community or former schooling. The system is often committed to maintaining personal and political hierarchy first, not legal equality.
You're highlighting that the subjective nature of administrative discipline often just completely undermines the law's attempt at objectivity.
Absolutely. The imposition of administrative discipline and sanctions, which can range from professional ruin to severe social consequence, remains fundamentally subjective. These sanctions are implemented at the discretion of the bureaucratic leader, they're often unreviewable by courts, and they carry immense weight. This demonstrates that equality before the law, the core tenet of rule of law, is still fundamentally alien to those who administer the system because they prioritize political and social coherence over abstract legal application.
And that brings us back to systemic coherence on the grandest scale. Why does a state of total control, like a centrally planned economy, inherently reject the rule of law?
Because the very concept of the rule of law requires a well-defined legal boundary, one drawn between the government and the governed, a guaranteed realm of citizen autonomy and rights. But if the government plans, produces, takes, and distributes everything, if the state is the total manager of all resources and all human activity, then there is no need, and indeed no space, to draw that legal boundary. The state's own logic, its rationale of total resource management and central planning, justifies its total control over every aspect of life. It makes the concept of independent, protected rights entirely redundant to the system's smooth operation.
And we see the struggle between technical coherence and messy, inconsistent human reality play out even in the seemingly superficial realm of popular culture. Which brings us to the Disney aura.
The Disney aura is a constructed system. It's designed to imbue their animated films with cult value. It's this powerful blend of nostalgia, the carefully cultivated founder's legacy, the myth of Uncle Walt, and the self-congratulatory conceit of innovative genius. This system tries to make the consumption of a Disney film feel like a unique, original, and deeply traditional event, rather than just another mechanically reproduced product.
And the 2019 Lion King remake broke that essential internal coherence for a large part of the audience.
It did, spectacularly. The remake was rendered using photorealistic, computer-generated aesthetics. This was a form of technical coherence making. The animals look scientifically and biologically accurate down to every hair and muscle twitch. The problem was that this aesthetic choice was fundamentally at odds with the film's fantastical, emotionally expressive narrative. In the original 1994 Cell animation, the audience happily suspends disbelief because the characters were designed to be emotionally legible.
But when you apply photorealism to a cartoon narrative, the emotional legibility just collapses.
Exactly. When Simba, a scientifically accurate lion, is required to react to the ghostly constellation image of Mufasa, his realistic lion face is visually muddled. A real lion doesn't know how to look sad or terrified or awestruck in the way a cartoon lion can, by raising an eyebrow or widening a teary eye. The aesthetic choice prioritized photorealistic accuracy, a technical, external coherence, over the necessary internal, emotional narrative coherence required for the story to land with impact. The technical perfection made the story emotionally illiterate. And this mirrors the global pattern. When systems face a conflict between maintaining their own rationalized logic, whether it's technical perfection, economic necessity, or political stability, and the messy, inconsistent, painful truth of human experience, they often choose to maintain the system's logic.
But the system may constantly strive to reduce human beings to functions or objects, but the human spirit, the body, and culture, they always find ways to resist, to reclaim agency and redefine value outside those dominant frameworks.
This resistance often takes the form of healing, which brings us to curanderismo, or Mexican folk medicine. This is a potent example of a syncretic, holistic approach, standing in sharp contrast to the fragmented, hyper-specialized approach of allopathic Western medicine.
Curanderismo is so much more than just herbal remedies. It addresses the whole personal, spiritual, and cultural health in a way that segmented medicine often fails to do.
Its appeal is its scope and its flexibility. A curandero or curandera combines Spanish religious influences, indigenous healing practices, and a fluid understanding of illness that accommodates contradictory philosophies. They tailor the practice to the individual and their community. This practice becomes a cultural anchor, and this is especially crucial for undocumented immigrants who are caught in the painful liminal space, feeling ni de aquí ni de allá, neither from here nor there.
For those navigating that profound cultural displacement and marginalization in a new land, this practice must provide a crucial sense of homecoming and recognition.
It does. It speaks in the social and cultural language of the patient. It diagnoses emotional traumas that Western medicine would simply categorize as stress or anxiety. For instance, diagnosing a spiritual ailment defined as a fractured or separated soul, and undertaking Olympia, a cleansing ritual, to reconcile that fracture and restore the person's equilibrium. When you view that against the history we just discussed, the systemic violence, the dehumanization, the toxic spraying of Braceros, the deeper meaning of the practice is just profound.
So the curandera and her community are providing a cultural and spiritual cleansing, not just of a physical illness, but of the systemic illness that America brought into the patient's body and spirit through exploitation and marginalization.
It's an act of sovereign resilience, a reclamation of the entire person, body, and soul from systems that sought to reduce them to a disposable working arm or a contagious body. They are asserting that their cultural and spiritual reality is more potent than the political and economic system that attempts to define them.
We see a different but equally powerful act of digital resistance in cultural performance, specifically in how the South Asian diaspora uses the Bollywood item song.
The item song, which is often a standalone, highly choreographed, and overtly sexualized musical number, it has become a North Star for identity construction and nostalgia for the diaspora in the West. It's a site of communal celebration where young practitioners learn the highly intricate techniques and specific technical choreography of the dance.
And the cultural tension really came to a head during the Osaki Saki TikTok controversy, where non-South Asian creators tried to mimic the choreography.
They tried to mimic it, but they altered one of the key technical movements. They replaced the sharp, aggressive hip thrust that is characteristic of the original choreography with a slower, smoother hip roll. This alteration seems minor, but South Asian creators immediately pushed back digitally, defending the technical integrity of the move.
So what was the critical viewpoint of that resistance? Why did defending the sharpness of a hip move become such an act of defiance?
Because the smoother, altered version perpetuated colonial stereotypes of Indian dance as inherently over-sexualized, passive, and fluid. Western tropes historically flattened the complexity and technical precision of Indian dance forms, reducing them to simple, exoticized, and sensual movements. By defending the correct, more aggressive choreography, creators were asserting culturally specific expertise. They were resisting the imposition of those reductive Western tropes onto their cultural practice. They emphasized that getting the dance right was a mark of respect for its origins and its technical complexity.
They weren't fighting the erotic nature of the item song itself. They were fighting the mischaracterization and simplification of it. They were asserting their agency over their own cultural expression and complexity.
And across every system we've explored, from the ancient legal justification of a woman's death to maintain state power, to colonial prerequisites for human worth, to modern economic structures designed to keep labor perpetually cheap, and even the framing of historical greatness, the pattern holds true. The central moral crisis is revealed when the system's own survival demands the justification of human suffering. The imperative to maintain the system's integrity, whether framed as coherence, necessity, or inevitability, is often valued above the immediate, painful reality of the victims it creates. This constant rationalization remains the most profound challenge to achieving universal justice.